Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we are diving into the Battle of Stalingrad, often seen as the turning point of World War II and the culmination point of Nazi Germany's total war in the East. It's perhaps the bitterest and bloodiest example of urban warfare, and like most big battles, it has given rise to myths that deserve a critical look. Hi Jesse, good to be back.
Yeah, especially because this is our 10th episode. So hopefully all you listeners out there have been enjoying it. If you're just finding us, this is our 10th episode. There are 9 others waiting for you out there in the catalog if you're interested in diving into all sorts of different aspects of World War II, as we're hoping to do today with the Battle of Stalingrad. Of course, it's a famous battle. Many of you out there are probably familiar with the basic outline of what happens. The Germans get surrendered and ground down, and it's got a lot of political significance. But when you drill down a little bit, I really think there's still all sorts of new things and fresh things to discover. How the fighting works, the tactical fighting, the different phases of the battle, what's going through the minds of people on both sides. In particular, I find it interesting to try to think about the mindset of the Germans who are caught in this cauldron and what facing that reality is like. We'll get into that a little bit later. But, of course, we're going to start at the beginning, folks. And that is, a battle of this size doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a backstory. There's a lead up to it all. And I think, Matthias, you're well placed to give us the backstory to Stalingrad before we get to the famous fighting in the city part. That doesn't happen just out of nowhere, right? So what's the lead up to this situation in the East?
Well, as you've already said, it's a huge battle, and it's probably wrong to just call it a battle, just in inverted commas. It's more of a campaign. So it really is the big campaign that the Germans launched in the East in 1942. And of course, it runs all the way into early 1943 as well. And to me, this is a very, very special place, I have to say. I've studied it in depth. I've been to Stalingrad a number of times. So I was lucky enough to be able to go there when we were still perhaps not friends with the Russians, but on speaking terms, let's call it. Say it's an absolutely, what is the right word? Fascinating, amazing. I wouldn't say wonderful place, but you know what I mean, listeners. I think you know what I mean. And it is quite interesting to me, having studied it, having lost a family member in Stalingrad as well. To me, it's one of the 2 places when I go there. I'm quite sure we'll not be going back there very, very soon. But when I did go there, this place and one other place, and that is Verdun, the First World War battlefield, the moment I hit the ground there, well, it sends shivers down my spine. So listeners, if you're interested in this and why it sends shivers down the spine, of course, listen to what we're talking about today. And you can also listen, of course, to our sister podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front, which covers the First World War. So, Jesse, just as you just said, let's look at what's the lead up. What is actually happening here? Why do the Germans decide to go towards Stalingrad? Well, we probably need to go back to the winter of 1941-1942. The failed German offensive on Moscow, the bitter and very cold and very costly and bloody winter battles that really, you might say, weaken, to a degree, perhaps even destroy the German army in the East. The losses are absolutely horrendous. They lose about, depends on how you look at it, between 30% and 50% of the manpower on the Eastern Front. And they've got hardly any reserves and reinforcements coming forward. So the army in 1942 is much weaker than it had been in 1941. Say another full-out attack like Barbarossa in 1941 is not possible. The army is too weak. So they need to concentrate on a sector that they think is the most important one. And the Soviets are expecting another big offensive towards Moscow, because that's what the Germans had tried in 1941. The general accepted view at that time is that he who controls Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg, controls the entire country. So the Soviets are expecting a replay, you might say, of 1941. The Germans look at it slightly differently now, because the strategic situation of Germany has fundamentally changed. Germany declared war on the USA in December 1941. There's another episode on that out there, folks, if you're interested in this, why America entered or had to enter the Second World War. And so the war's now changed. And Hitler is quite a grand strategic thinker, and he's better at this. I hesitate to use the word clever talking about Hitler, but better at this than his military generals, who are only thinking about military operations. He realizes that the character of the entire war is changing now. It's going to be a long war. It's going to be an economic war. Germany needs oil to keep the tanks running, also to send the U-boats to the east coast of the US. Hitler realizes without oil, as he says, is without the oil, I have to liquidate the war. That's the term that he uses. And so he looks at the map, and where can he get oil from? And that's in the Caucasus. That's where the big oil fields are. So whereas 1941 sees the drive towards Moscow, the destruction of the Soviet army, the Soviet forces, now the idea is to go into that part of the Soviet Union and to occupy the oil fields. That's the main aim of Case Blue, Fall Blau, as the Germans call this particular operation. Takes the Soviets completely by surprise. They keep all their reserves up in the northern area, in and around Moscow, because, as I said, they're thinking there's going to be a replay of 1941. The Germans have got very, very different plans. So that comes with all sorts of issues and problems, of course. The army is small, the army is weakened on the German side. And that means, for example, you need to look at things like flank protection when you go towards Stalingrad, thinking that you've got Soviet forces still in the north. So, Jesse, talk us through the long German flanks and what's happening there. What is the issue?
Well, the issue, as you pointed out, is that they're not capable of doing everything that they want to do anymore. I think, if memory serves, that there was an internal survey of the German army as to the condition of their divisions on the Eastern Front in early 1942, and only a handful of divisions were deemed fully capable for offensive operations. Now, of course, they've improved that and topped that up by July, when they're starting to launch Case Blue. But that's a far cry, as you say, from 1941. You can still have a good core of divisions with armor that's going to slice through the unprepared Soviet lines in Ukraine and southern Russia, and get you maybe into the Caucasus, and get you maybe to the Volga. But what are you going to do with those hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of flanks? And that's where one of these much discussed aspects of the Stalingrad campaign comes into play, which is Germany's allies on the Eastern Front. But before we get into them in more detail, I want to say one word about the Soviets, because, as you mentioned, they're caught a little on the back foot, but they know that things are coming in the summer. They get the details wrong, but they know that things are coming. And Stalin, though, still wants, it's almost a little bit, it's the reverse of what you're talking about with Hitler and his generals, where Stalin is keen to go onto the attack. He just wants to push wherever it can be pushed for 1942. But the general staff, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, they convince him, actually, we should wait and pick our spots, and in summer 1942, be on the strategic defensive and use a counteroffensive. We'll see what the Germans do. Turns out they do what we don't expect, but hey, that's okay, because we're preparing for a counterstroke. It's not totally okay. I shouldn't say that. There's a huge crisis when the Germans start moving forward. But the idea of the counteroffensive is still there. There's also the famous order number 227 that comes out from Stalin in July 1942, basically saying any officer who orders or allows an unauthorized retreat will be put on trial. Being put on trial in Stalin's Soviet Union is kind of a nice euphemism for either getting shot, sent to the gulag, and then possibly getting shot or sent to a punitive battalion, these Strafbats, as the Soviets called them, to be then sent into whatever near suicidal attack. So you can see the Soviets are also responding to this strategic situation in their own way. I do think it's also relevant before I send this back to you, because I can see you're on the edge of your seat to chime in here. But I also think it's interesting that the German plan, Case Blue, is pushed back several times. It was originally planned for May, but then you have things that happen like the local Soviet offensive near Kharkiv. Then you also have the Soviet garrison holding out in Sevastopol in Crimea, Sevastopol, usually in English. And that delays the Germans yet again. So all these factors are building up to what becomes the disaster of Stalingrad.
Absolutely. So you can see here that even the Germans are not overly convinced that this is really going to go their way, even before they launched the operation. And you talked about the Soviets. And the Germans understand in 1942 that the Soviet army hasn't been defeated, hasn't been destroyed. So what they'd hoped to achieve in 1941 hasn't happened. And the Germans realized this. And there's a very fascinating and eye-opening report from the German intelligence services, Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, under this chap called Gehlen, who later on becomes the head of the West German Secret Service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. And before the Germans even launched the operation, they assessed the situation. And they say, well, even if Germany and the German military manages to seize all the objectives that are set, so that Stalingrad, which, by the way, first spoiler alert here, is only a secondary objective in the original plan. We'll return to all this, of course, later on. And also manages to get their hands on the oil fields in the Caucasus and occupy them. The report very clearly states that even if the Germans manage to do this, they will not be able to defeat the Soviet armies and deal them such a blow that they would be incapable of launching another attack in the summer or in the winter of 1943. So basically what he's saying here, Gehlen and this report, is that whatever happens, you might argue Germany's already lost the war. Because if you don't defeat the army now, and then you've got the Americans coming into the war in ever greater numbers, you're going to lose the initiative. And this means, in the long run, you're probably going to lose. And that wasn't written with the benefit of hindsight. This is the official German intelligence assessment of the strategic situation in the spring of 1942. So it's not looking all that good and all that well for the Germans, even before they begin. And when you then go into the logistical problems that you have, an absolute nightmare on the German side. And again, we've talked about in other podcasts before, the Germans are not very good at logistics, but they do understand what the issues are here. So basically what you have is you've got one monorailway line going from Rostov all the way towards Stalingrad. And that means you have to supply basically two armies, because it's the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army. These are the two armies, the spearheads that go in, using this one monorailway line. And this is simply not going to be enough. And again, there's an assessment by the head of the logistical supply of the German army. He says, if we're going to do this, and we're going to attack towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, and we're not going to defeat the Soviets very quickly, these armies are going to starve. And this is what they say before the operation is launched. So they understand there are huge shortcomings. It's a massive gamble. They're still willing to do it. First of all, because Hitler orders it. There is a strategic reason behind that, but it is a huge and a massive gamble on the German side. The interesting thing is when they look at the early phases of this entire campaign, it looks actually as if the Germans are winning. It looks really, really good. So they're advancing and they're spearheading and they're pushing through the Soviet lines. So it does look really, really good. So no one really talks about the first phase because everyone always concentrates on the battle itself, the Battle of Stalingrad, the urban fighting. But I think it's really important to look at what happens before that because that sets the scene. It also creates a mindset in both the Soviet and the German armies, which then sets the scene again for the Battle of Stalingrad itself. So the attack is finally launched in July, 17th of July, that when it comes in. So quite early on, because again, we tend to think about the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter, lots of snow, very cold, people freezing to death. This entire operation starts at the height of the summer of 1942, the 17th of July. So, Jesse, just give us some ideas. What actually happens in this early phase?
Well, as you say, the going is good for the Germans at first. They're slicing through the Soviet positions. They're penetrating further into Russia, both towards the Caucasus region and the oil. Caucasus is still full of oil today, by the way. This is why Azerbaijan has become a wealthy nation, why it's able to defeat its neighbor Armenia in wars, why the European Union signs treaties with it, and so on. There's still a lot of oil in that area. And so you have one part of the German army group heading down there. You have the other part that heads towards Stalingrad, because after the initial offensive begins, about a week after, I believe, 10 days after, I think July 23rd, Hitler orders that Stalingrad be taken as well. So he kind of splits up his forces, which are already thinner than a military mind would probably like them to be. He orders the army group split in two, one to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and one then down south to the Caucasus. Now, the Soviets get a bit nervous about the opening phase of the offensive because they don't expect to be giving up this kind of ground. They don't expect that the Germans will still be able to inflict this kind of operational defeat on them. And there's a fair bit of nervousness in Moscow and among the political and military leaders about what's happening. So, of course, then they try to rush reinforcements down to bolster the defensives, but it's still a bit of a tricky situation. Now, when the Germans reach the city of Stalingrad, actually, no, we shouldn't rush. We shouldn't rush here. We're not the Germans. We're not trying to take all our objectives as quickly as possible here. Let's talk about the decision to split that army group in two, because I think that has some significance. And in the historical debates about the battle, Hitler comes in for some serious criticism here. And even some of his own generals say that, well, it was this, it was that. Take us through that decision-making process. Why does Hitler decide to put more emphasis on the city of Stalingrad once the operations already started? As you say, it was a secondary consideration for securing the flank at first.
Well, you've already said the magic word here. It's all about securing the flank. And when you look at the original German plan, it comes in different stages. The first stage of the attack actually goes in towards the northeast from the front line, towards a place called Voronezh. Again, we've heard quite a bit about this in recent years. The idea there is to reach the River Don to offer flank protection. The River Don is not a river that normally features in Western thinking. I've stood on the banks of the River Don many times talking logistics, talking engineering. And I remember having one discussion several years back when it was discussed amongst military personnel how NATO would cross this particular river. And the conclusion people came to, I'm not a bridge expert, so I just listened to it. The conclusion they came to was that within all of NATO at that stage, there wasn't enough bridging material to cross the River Don. That just tells you already how big it is. It's much, much smaller than the River Volga. We'll come to the Volga later on, but even the Don is big. So once you've secured that flank to the north, it will be very difficult for the Soviets, who still have most of their reserves up in the north, in and around the Moscow area, to push them down to attack in the flanks. That attack goes reasonably well. They then go into stage 2, which is pushing towards Stalingrad. Again, there's a Don bend, so they need to cross the River Don here. Get across the River Don, then push onto Stalingrad. From there, once you've achieved that, when you look at the geography, there is another bend of the Don, and you also hit the Volga then. You secure these areas, you secure the banks of these rivers, and it will be extremely difficult for the Soviets to attack you in the flank. And then the last push, the most important push, would then take you down into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields. So the first push goes well. Then you go into the second push. That also goes really well. And the Germans are really surprised, sometimes confused, because they hardly encounter any Soviet resistance. They just keep pushing and driving and marching. These distances, by the way, are huge. These are hundreds of kilometers. It's very easy to get lost in the Soviet landscape. And this is something that we quite often underestimate, forget about when we look at campaigns in the East. So the Germans keep advancing. It's the height of summer. It's boiling hot. They are sweating. It's nothing like what we expect the Battle of Stalingrad to be like. And they just keep pushing and advancing. And the reports are really, well, you might say confusing or very, very positive. They say, we're not encountering any Soviet soldiers. Everyone thinks, you know what, this is probably it. Maybe we have done it. Maybe the Soviets don't have any reserves left. And the first time they really encounter Soviet troops is then once they've crossed the River Don. And there the Soviets stand and fight. Not all the troops, but there is a bit of fighting going on there. It's a classic example of this whole, if we want to use that word, we've talked about this in a previous episode as well, blitzkrieg, so combined arms maneuver, the Germans being very victorious. And they think, okay, that was the last line of resistance. Let's just keep on pushing. It's also very, very interesting when you look at what the Soviets say about this particular episode. When you look at the official accounts, when you look at the writing after the war, they say this was all part of a huge plan.
Of course they do.
Of course they do. Well, basically get the Germans in and then get them into the city of Stalingrad, then counterattack, and as it happened, then destroy 6th Army. Well, actually, I have talked to some Soviet veterans who were fighting there at that particular time. On one of these tours, we had veterans with us. And they said, you know what, that might have been the plan, while we were just running away because we'd been through the battles in 1941. We didn't want to have the same thing again. So they were just running away. Well, it doesn't matter what the truth is. Probably both is true. But the consequence of that is that the Germans get overconfident. And they think, you know what, we've done it. So why not speed up this operation? Why not have one of the armies, so that's 4th Panzer Army, move down towards the Caucasus, while 6th Army, which, by the way, at the time was the strongest formation in the German Wehrmacht, they can move forward and seize the original objective, which is the city of Stalingrad. By the way, it's not about the city of Stalingrad. More about this in a minute. It's more about reaching the River Volga and cutting off the supply line, because 90% of the oil that the Soviets are using in the Moscow area to keep their tanks running there comes from these oil fields we already discussed, and that's all shipped across and down the River Volga. So you can see it's the Germans are falling victim to a perceived success, which isn't really a success, and that, of course, is going to hit them the moment they get to the outskirts of the city of Stalingrad. So really, really difficult. The wrong decision, of course, with the benefit of hindsight. They thought it was a good one, and they're going to pay very dearly for that when they hit the city. So we've now reached the outskirts of the city of Stalingrad, and everyone's getting ready for the big fight in the city. So let's have a look at this. So let's have a look at the second phase of this big operation, the one that everyone associates with. It's in the name, isn't it? The Battle of Stalingrad. It kind of gives it away. So let's have a closer look at this. Jesse, over to you. What can you tell us about Stalingrad and the opening phases?
Well, the opening phase of the battle for Stalingrad proper, let's say, just so we can orient ourselves in time here, it starts in mid-September. So that's when the Germans reach the outskirts of the city, and the battle, as we mostly perceive it, as you say, an urban battle into the fall, getting into colder weather, into winter, it starts in mid-September. I do think it's worth pointing out before we fully jump into the urban struggle from mid-September until February, let's say, or at least let's go until November, but we'll get into the details in a moment, is that the Volga is also important not only for the Soviets shipping their oil from the Caucasus up into the Soviet heartland, but it's also a major waterway that's used for transporting Lend-Lease aid that's coming through Persia, today's Iran, from the Americans and British. So that would be another objective, a secondary one, but still worth mentioning, I think, that the Germans could achieve if they were able to capture Stalingrad and cut off the Volga. And the Volga, by the way, I also had the chance to visit Stalingrad as a tourist several years ago. Again, perhaps for the last time in my time on this earth, but we'll see. Hopefully happier days are ahead. And it is massive. It's an unbelievably impressive work of nature. It's an absolutely massive thing, and you can see why a city like Stalingrad would become such a transportation and logistics hub, being on a river of that width and length. And you can also see why the Soviets fight so hard to defend it, and also some of the problems they have reaching the city, which is mostly anyway, or where the fighting goes on, is mostly on the western bank of the river. So the Soviets, if they want to reach the city, once the fighting really begins there, they have to cross the river. And that's going to add a wrinkle into the urban fighting that we're going to get into in a moment. I do also want to point out one other operation on the topic of flanks, because the flanks are going to come back to bite the Germans in the behind, and we're going to come back to them as well. David Glantz, who's one of the main historians, who's one of the most widely read historians on the Eastern Front, says that there are a series of small operations north of the city. He calls them the Kotluban operations, where the Soviets are able to make a stand before the urban fighting really reaches its peak. And Glantz argues that by the Soviets being able to slow down the Germans and prevent them from building up that flank protection, that they set the stage for the eventual German failure already in August and early September. And so that I thought was an interesting, of course, these setting the stage for future failure things are very much easier in hindsight, but nonetheless, I think it really brings out the importance of some smaller operations if they're in the right place, right? You can win somewhere else, but if you don't win at a critical place and time, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to achieve your objective. The other element to the lead up to this urban fighting is the air aspect, where the Luftwaffe, it's not as strong as it was in previous years, of course, since they're having to divert some strength to the Caucasus front, of course, but also to home defense against Western bombing. That is still not massive in summer, fall 1942, but it is picking up, and the Mediterranean as well, of course. They bombed Stalingrad to smithereens in August. There's some of the heaviest, if not the heaviest, bombing raids on the entire Eastern Front. Meanwhile, the Soviets, of course, are in a last-ditch effort to prepare defenses. They're forcing civilians to dig trenches. They've got female units manning anti-aircraft guns, for example. The NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, which is the predecessor to the FSB, they're forcibly, of course, since that's kind of their style, forcibly organizing untrained, barely armed civilian militias who end up not playing a significant role in the battle, but nonetheless, this is kind of the atmosphere on the Soviet side. And then the battle for the actual city begins. And here you're going to end up with, not exclusively, but I think the most famous formation on the Soviet side is the 62nd Army under a general by the name of Chuikov, who's going to make his reputation essentially at Stalingrad, especially for being a commander in urban warfare, facing off against this 6th German army, as you say, under von Paulus, whose name is going to come up again because he has a bit of an interesting end. And those are the forces that are clashing. So that's kind of my setup for the urban battle. Why don't you take us through how that urban battle plays out in September, October, and November? On second thought, I should correct myself. It's not von Paulus. I mistakenly ennobled the man, and he by no means is deserving of that in hindsight. Friedrich Paulus was the commander of 6th Army. Anyway, Matthias, take us through some of this urban fighting, because now we're getting into the meat of this battle and what makes it so compelling as a dramatic and tragic and awful historic event.
Absolutely. And how could you have a German general who's not a member of nobility? You see, this is where it all falls down. So there we go. There you have it. That's all the disaster of Stalingrad writ large. The fighting itself, absolutely. So you already mentioned some of the key dates. So the fighting really starts in September. It's actually on the 23rd of August that the Germans reach the outskirts of Stalingrad. There is a reconnaissance unit under chap called Strachwitz, and they reach the Volga in the northern sector of the city, and that is a place called Rynok. They establish a defensive position and start firing at the ships that keep going up and down. To begin with, well, they can't really achieve anything because that's a recce unit. They don't have big guns. And then they're getting attacked. They actually have to withdraw as well. And there's all sorts of small stuff happening in that sector as well. But the 23rd is also important because you already talked about the bombing by the Luftwaffe. That's also the date when the German Air Force bombed Stalingrad, destroying about 90% of the dwelling houses and the infrastructure. So it's a very, very, if you want to call it successful air raid. Of course, the nasty thing about this is they killed tens of thousands of civilians. No one knows how many civilians were killed during that air raid or the subsequent fighting. The problem is that Stalin does not want the civilians to be evacuated to the eastern bank or to other places, because he says if we got civilians in the ruins of the city, the soldiers will fight harder. And both Stalin and Hitler, the Soviets and the Germans, realize once you hold the city of Stalingrad, it is very, very difficult to get back into the fight, just because it is such a big river. You already mentioned it. So when I was there, our guide told us at the narrowest point in the Stalingrad area, it's 999 meters wide. On average, it's about 2.5 kilometers. That is a huge river. It is big. So how can you cross from one bank to the other if you don't have a foothold here? And that means one of the key things that is really, really important, which you only realize when you're there, when you stand on the banks of the river, you see how steep they are. And it's nothing that the Germans really had in the operational planning, but when you look at how the battle plans out, you can see the importance of, and this is the landing stages. There are a number of landing stages on the west bank of the Volga, and this is the only place where the Soviets can feed in reinforcements, and these become the strong points of the Soviet defense, and we're going to look at all this in a bit more detail. So how do you actually fight your way in and through a city like Stalingrad? First of all, Stalingrad is big. It stretches about 6 to 7 kilometers from the west to the east to the banks of the Volga, and about 30 kilometers north to south. It is a big, big city, even by the standards, or even by It is a big, big city, even in 1942. It's a model city. It's a very communist city. It's modern. It is probably the most advanced city that the Soviets have, and it is an industrial hub. About 1/3 of all the T-34s at that time are produced in this particular city. So the entire northern part of it is industrial. Lots of workshops, factories, which of course will make it very difficult to fight through for the Germans. And in inverted commas, easy, everything in Stalingrad has to be taken in inverted commas, easy for the Soviets to defend. So the Germans get towards the city. The first unit that they encounter, you already talked about these untrained people and these untrained soldiers. So the Germans advance, and they come under fire from an anti-aircraft unit, because there are quite a few of those, because it's a big industrial hub, so you have to defend the factories. So they're getting fired, but even the Germans are confused and surprised because, well, these shots all go long and short and nothing's hitting anything. So they just basically rush towards it and bring their tanks forward, and they seize this particular anti-aircraft unit, and to their shock and horror, they find out this had been manned by female fighters, amongst others, for example, factory workers who've been brought out, put in front of the gun, well, just fired the Germans as they advance. So that shows you a little bit about the general desperation that you find in the Soviet camp at that particular time. The city is flat. Yes, it's urban. There is one elevation, and that sits right bang in the center, and that's an ancient artificial burial ground, the Mamayev Kurgan, it's called. And this becomes one of the scenes where most of the fighting happens, because this place gives you a perfect view over the entire city, and also the east bank of the Volga, where the Soviets have their resupply, they're feeding in their reinforcements. So if you control this, that gives you the perfect artillery spotter position. So some of the very heaviest fighting is in that particular area, which in those days is not built up. Got a number of water tanks there, but that's it. So again, this picture that everything is happening, all the fighting is happening in houses, is not necessarily true. The Germans sent in the divisions, and they do it in different phases. The first phase goes into the southern part of the city, which is this slightly older one, wooden buildings, wooden huts, most of them destroyed, burnt down by that stage, and they fight their way through. And then they hit one particular building, which becomes, even in the early stages of the battle, the symbol for the fighting and the intensity of the fighting. And that's the so-called grain silo. It's a huge building. It still stands there today. And the Germans and the Soviets fight it out, and it takes several days. The Germans use troops from 3 divisions to fight their way into this building and to basically get the Soviets out, who initially defended with just a handful of soldiers. These are mainly naval infantry. Later on reinforced, and after a few days of fighting, they're then defeated, having inflicted very, very large casualties on the Germans and really slowed down the German advance. And it's interesting that at that stage, the Germans are already thinking ahead, and in their heads, of course, they've already won the Battle of Stalingrad. So you want to have a campaign shield, because that's what they had for very heavy fighting. You'd have a shield, like later one for the Crimea and other places. And the Stalingrad shield, which you've worn on the sleeve, if the Germans had won, showed the grain silo. So you can see the importance that even the Germans attach to this. So they're fighting their way through this, and then they go in the second phase into the city center, and in the third phase they're then trying to fight their way through the industrial complex in the north. The problem for the Germans is this is an army that is, first of all, at that stage already malnourished. They're not particularly strong. The infantry forces are quite weak. So one of the divisions, when it attacks the grain silo, is an infantry division, and it's supposed to have an infantry fighting strength of somewhere in the region of, let's say, 10,000 people. When they attack, their fighting strength of that division is down to 535 men. And that's the early days when they think they're winning. So that already, again, puts things into context. And this is an army that is not trained for this type of war. They don't want to go into the urban. The Soviets are not trained for this either. But being on the defensive is always slightly easier, because you're defending, you kind of hold the initiative in an urban terrain when you're doing this. And so this becomes an extremely, extremely bloody match between these two armies. And they're both just, you might say, trying to throw numbers at it. It's not competence on neither side, it's just your numbers. The Germans have to use tank formations because they're running out of infantry, which is not particularly good because it's relatively easy for the Soviets to knock out these tanks. The Soviets are drip feeding in reinforcements just so that the Germans can be kept occupied, and it becomes a very nasty war. The Germans call it the Verdun on the Eastern Front. Coming back to what I said earlier about the Battle of Verdun, which of course meant an awful lot to Germans at the time. And it also becomes known as the Rats War, the Rattenkrieg, as they call it, because it's so intense. It's also fought in the Suez. It's a 3-dimensional war. So even for urban fighting today, there's a lot that you can learn from the Battle of Stalingrad. So it's really, really nasty. It's not a place where you want to be. Casualties are mounting on both sides. They're absolutely horrendous, and it's really awful. By November, early December, Germans have managed to seize about 90% of the city. And you can see there's a bit of mission creep going in. So just another push, and we will have won. They fly in a number of specialist engineers battalions. They all burn out and basically die very, very quickly. So it's horrendous for both sides. And the Soviets are keeping the Germans occupied in the city center. And they're doing it really, really well, very sophisticated. So this whole idea that, well, the Soviets don't know how to fight, they just throw numbers at it, well, far from it. When you look at some of the sophisticated approaches that they use, they're actually beginning to outwit the Germans here. So they're fighting really, really well. Still suffering huge casualties, just like the Germans, but they still got more reserves. They can drip feed them. So the Germans have seized 90% of the city. And then more and other things happen. I've talked for far too long already. Jesse, over to you.
Well, when you're talking about this urban fighting and the grinding nature of it, and the grain elevator or grain silo, and how much damage the Soviets were able to inflict from this one small tactical position, I think it's worth pointing out that there are all sorts of those. So after the grain silo, there's another one and another one. And I'll just name a few of the most famous ones to give listeners out there an idea of these positions that just kind of keep coming, that the Soviets defend so bitterly. There's, of course, the tractor factory. There's the Red October factory. There's the Barricadi arms factory. There's what becomes known as Pavlovs house, which the Soviets managed to hold for about 2 months. There's Gerhard's mill, for example. And then there's the hill you mentioned, the Mamayev Kurgan, which is now the spot where this massive, massive monument of a woman, some interpret her nowadays as Mother Russia, others have different, Soviet Union type of incarnation of the Soviet Union or what have you, symbol of the Soviet Union, now stands on that Mamayev Kurgan hill. So you just keep having these that are tempting you, as you mentioned, for one more push. The railway station is another one, for example. It changes hands 18 times in 4 days, in a 4-day period in September. So this gives you an idea of the complete madness that was going on. And as far as the urban fighting tactics, they start off, as you mentioned, both sides, kind of approaching the problem a little bit bluntly and using whatever they have, be it tanks compensating for lack of infantry, be it armed factory workers compensating for lack of everything. But, and this is how Chuikov builds his reputation as a master of urban warfare. That's why he's going to have a prominent role later in the war, for example, in the Battle of Berlin, in the urban fighting there. He, and I'm sure there are others, but usually this is associated with him. Of course, he's not doing this all personally. He's the commander of an entire army. But 62nd Army starts using these hugging tactics. I think Chuikov called them hugging tactics, where they try to keep Soviet positions so close to the German positions that they negate partly the German ability to hit them with artillery or hit them with tactical air support, because then you're going to be hitting your own positions as well. You mentioned the sewers, so they'll go underneath German positions, pop out behind, raid them, confuse them, inflict casualties. Also, if they knew the Germans were planning a local attack on one of these anchor points, be it the Red October factory or Pavlov's house or what have you, they would launch a spoiling ambush. So a little local attack to hit those units of the Germans that are preparing their own attack and throw them off balance and kind of prevent the Germans from doing what they want to do. It's a way of taking the initiative back, even if you're being pushed back for the time being, as the Soviets were. And they become masters of booby traps. So when they're giving up ground, when they're giving up a building or a neighborhood, they put all sorts of booby traps of all kinds of different devilish ingenuity that further slows the Germans, that further stresses the Germans, that further interrupts the German ability to plan, and of course inflicts casualties, which the Germans can't really stand. Sniping is a big part of the battle, made famous by the movie, of course.
Oh my God.
Enemy at the Gates, which is a historian's nightmare, of course. But there's a lot of sniping that goes on during the battle as well. And of course, the battle gives rise to this story, which has truth behind it, of course, as well, of the Soviet blocking units, where you have the NKVD, right, the security service, not regular army, that organizes blocking detachments to potentially fire on Soviet troops who are retreating, to essentially keep them in the front line, regardless of their morale, regardless of their discipline, regardless even of whatever local orders they've received sometimes. The estimates of how many people they actually kill or how many people they arrest and potentially send to the Gulag or to Strafbataillons vary. Some say they detain up to 50,000 men, that they execute about 1,000 of them. Anthony Beaver, in his book, claims that they killed about 13,000, but that's definitely at the upper end of the scale, and that's also kind of disputed. There's also a huge debate about how much is Red Army terror a motivator for the Soviet soldiers. I read a few interesting interviews with veterans who said, we were relieved when Stalin's famous order number 227 came, saying that no one can retreat, because then we knew what the score was. We knew that everyone has the same order, that no one's going to retreat, that I'm standing here until I die, and the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy. And for some of them, I'm not saying this was across the board, because it wasn't, but I think it's an interesting element that it created, in part, this coercion, some aspect of solidarity, some aspect of, I hesitate to use the word, but like trust by default, not because you actually trust the other guy. In the Soviet system, trust is not a big thing, but you trust him because you know that he has no choice also. So you can kind of count a bit more on the camaraderie of coercion, if you want to put it that way. So I think those are some of the interesting aspects of the battle to me. If we take a step back and look at it as a whole, those are some of the things that I think about when I think about Stalingrad.
I think these are very, very important points and factors, and again, quite often overlooked. And I think it's also interesting that when you look at the Soviets, because we always, in inverted comma, have a go at the Soviets for being very brutal and very nasty and shooting their own people. But when you look at what the Germans do, it's not much better towards the end of the war. So again, statistics vary, but they're probably executing in the region of 20,000 of their own people during the course of the war. And the very, very vast majority of these, of course, get executed in the last month of the war. So you find that on all sides. And of course, while being there as a Soviet soldier, it's not particularly nice. I mean, when you, again, look at another statistic, if you are a young Soviet man aged 18 on the 22nd of June 1941, when the Germans invade, your chances of coming through the war unharmed, whether it's killed or wounded, stand at less than 5%. So this really is a generation that gets hit. Yeah, it's very, very nasty. But as you said, there is the order, the Stalin order, and they all understand that this really is where you have to make the stand. This is where you stand and fight. You also have the reports from the Germans when they reach the banks of the Volga and they say, we've done it now. We've won the war. All we need to do is seize Stalingrad and that'll be it. There's no chance the Soviets will be able to come back. And also don't forget the logistical problems, because to the east of the Volga, it's just basic. It's flat, open steppe country. The first time I realized this was flying from Moscow down to modern-day Volgograd, of course, and you look out the window and it's several hours of just this flat, open, prairie steppe country. And my immediate thought was, what did the Germans actually want here? So the same question that the Soviets quite often asked when they got into Germany, why did you invade? You've got everything. Why did you come to us? And that was the thought that was going through my head. It's just mind-boggling. So you can see these psychological factors, of course, play a very, very important role as well. But they're very successful, the Soviets, in what they do. So the tactical fight, they're very good. Yes, they suffer casualties. The Germans are suffering casualties as well. And don't forget the logistical resupply issues. Even at this stage, getting everything, every round you fire, every bite of food that you get has to be transported from Germany or somewhere in the Soviet Union. So these logistical challenges are very, very big. And that means that, again, the Germans are operating on a shoestring. They're running out of material. They're also running out of manpower. That's a big, big problem. So they look at the map and they realize there is something brooding. Something is happening to the north and to the south. And you talked about this earlier, these Soviet spoiling attacks. In the north, the Germans are not even able to eliminate the last Soviet bridgeheads on the south bank of the River Don. They know they're there. And the Germans look at them and say, one last push, and we'll have seized not 90%, 95%, but 100% of the city. We can then start regrouping. Because the Germans don't really trust the Allies. I mean, mainly the Italians and the Romanians, because they're not very well trained, they're badly led, they're badly equipped. That's the perception at that particular time. And okay, you go to the quiet sectors, that's the north and the south, the flank, whereas the Germans fight in the city. And of course, that's an invitation, you might say, for the Soviets to do something that's hitting the Germans now, or the Allies, we should say, because not only Germans who end up in the pocket. And that, of course, is the big Uranus, the Soviet counterattack, which is launched on the 19th of November. So, Jesse, talk us through it.
Yes, this is the great Soviet counterstroke that comes. Once the Germans have kind of ground themselves down in the city, they have to use the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Italians to cover these long flanks leading towards the city. And here's the opportunity for the Soviets to do what they are rapidly becoming much better at, which is send large mechanized forces to penetrate weak spots in the enemy line and cut them off, right? So that's what happens on November 19th. In 4 days, 2 Soviet pincers hit north and south of the German positions. They break through not only Romanian positions, but I would say mostly, or the Romanians are the most prominent units that are holding these areas that get hit. And they're able to surround the Germans in a pocket. By November 23rd, this pocket is closed. It includes about 330,000 Axis soldiers inside the pocket, not only Germans, as you mentioned, but also some other allied units. And it includes about 50,000 Heavies. Now, Heavy is a German wartime word. Can you give us a brief definition here before I carry on? Since as the native German speaker, who are these 50,000 Heavies who are caught with the German army in Stalingrad?
So Heavy, as you say, is the term that the Germans use. It means Hilfswilliger. So these are people, mainly previous prisoners of war, Soviets prisoners of war, who volunteer, that's where the Hilfswilliger comes in, to volunteer to support the German army. And by that stage, basically every unit, down to probably company level, had a few of these Heavies. And they were doing tasks like washing clothes, if you were in a static position, perhaps trying to grow some food, things like this. So supporting the army. And of course, the Germans like it because you get the support. And of course, the Soviet soldiers doing that, well, they liked it because, well, let's face it, otherwise you probably starve in a prisoner of war camp. So that's why quite a few of those were willing to do that. Very, very bad situation, rock and a hard place here, because, well, you've got a bad situation while in the prisoner of war camp in Germany. If the Soviets managed to capture you afterwards, if you were lucky if you were sent to Gulag because you were seen as a traitor. But so there, as you already said, there are quite a few that the Germans use on the Eastern Front at that particular time.
One might say they're collaborating, but of course, if you look at the reasons for that, you can see where the motivation is, right? Since several million Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death or killed in other various direct and indirect means in German captivity. But outside of this pocket, you have these flanks that have now been penetrated, and there's a whole discussion about why this happens. Are the Romanians at fault? Did they perform badly? Well, part of the discussion, I think, is looking at those Romanian and Hungarian units, for example, in context. They know that their situation is vulnerable. They ask for support, more heavy weapons, more troops to man the line better, and they don't get much. The Germans don't give them enough heavy weapons, and they're stretched extremely thin. Just the other day, I read that some Hungarian platoons, so platoon is like what, 30 to 50 men, 20 to 50 men, depending on, circumstance and so forth. Some of them are covering up to 2 kilometers with one platoon on these extended flanks around Stalingrad. So it's no wonder that this collapses. If a German platoon is covering 2 kilometers, they're also not going to be able to hold the line. So there's quite a discussion about, how much can the allies of Germany be blamed? It is a convenient thing to do from a German perspective, is blame your southern allies who are not of the fighting German race and so on and so forth. How do you see that discussion?
I think that's an absolutely valid point. And yes, there's only so much you can ask. There are also political reasons. You mentioned Romanians, you talked about Hungarians. The most important thing is never let them fight alongside each other because they'll be at each other's throats. There are accounts from that particular time. And again, have to be taken with a pinch of salt, probably, because they're written by the German liaison officers who are really looking down on these people. And they say they're extremely badly led. The officers are awful. The NCOs are awful. The men are actually okay, but they're badly trained, badly led, and very, very badly equipped. So you could say, well, why didn't you give them more weapons then? Well, the reason is because the Germans don't have enough for themselves. And if you don't really trust them, the last thing you want to do is give them more weapons. But you also have in that context, for example, in the northern sector, there is a German tank division, which is there as they called it in those days, the core set bones, so basically strengthening the defense there. And when the attack comes in on the 19th, these guys jump into their tanks, trying to drive off, and they hit the start button, but nothing happens. Because what happened is by that stage, it's now November, it's cold. In order to keep the tanks reasonably warm, they put lots of straw in there. With straw come mice, and the mice had eaten all the cables. So you can see even on the German side, things aren't all particularly brilliant. I mean, this one division wouldn't have made a huge difference. In the end, it rolls into battle. But it just shows you again that we have to be careful that, as I always say, in war, things are not black and white. There's a lot of gray wherever you look. And I think that's a very, very good example of that.
So what happens then is that, the pocket is created by Operation Uranus, but it's not like the Soviets' grip on their encirclement is particularly strong. So there's always a chance then, well, maybe the Germans try to break out of the pocket. Maybe they send reinforcements from the west and push and relieve the pocket. And that's why the Soviets then launch another operation, Operation Little Saturn, in December, where they push further west. So then they push the Germans and the remnants of the Romanians, Hungarians, and so forth. They push them farther away from Stalingrad and from the isolated Sixth Army. And that really solidifies the Soviet situation. There is then a big discussion on the German side. Should we try a breakout? Yes or no? There is an attempt. So Manstein leads an attempt at Operation Winter Storm in December. So to move, to counterattack from the west towards the pocket. It doesn't get far enough. It doesn't make enough progress. But there's never an attempt to break out at the same time from the pocket. And this was a subject of quite a bit of debate in German headquarters at the time. Why don't you take us through that? What are the factors that they're considering, political, military, and why do they not try to break out from the Stalingrad pocket at all?
Well, the problem that you find here is that, particularly after the second operation that you already mentioned, there is so much space now between the pocket and the German front line that the calculations by the logisticians say that the army does not have enough petrol to break through the enemy lines and then reach the German lines. And they are worried that if they attack and try to break out, that they're going to be stranded in the open. And this is now winter. It is cold. You've got lots of snow. These people are malnourished. You've got people dying of starvation at that stage. So the fear is that when you break out, they'd just be completely annihilated by the Soviets out in the open. And then, of course, you need to swing around and look at what goes on in Berlin at the time. The Luftwaffe Göring, well, they're still full of pride, probably, or I'm not quite sure what. And he promises Hitler that, well, the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is able to supply the army. So the idea is the army stays put, is supplied from the air, has a defensive position, and come the summer, there's going to be another, or the spring at least, a big operation to relieve these troops. There had been in the year before a similar situation, and that's the pocket at Demyansk. And that worked. And they had German troops in there supplied by the air. And the moment the weather gets better, they are relieved. The problem is that Stalingrad is a much, much bigger pocket. And the Air Force simply does not have enough planes to fly in the required material, the required food, and what have you. And it comes with all sorts of problems. First of all, you have 3 airports in the big pocket. The pocket is huge. Again, we need to move away from this understanding that's all about the city of Stalingrad. We're now looking at a pocket which is about 50 kilometers east to west. And most of the fighting at that time doesn't happen in the city. The Germans, as we said earlier, control most of the city. Most of the fighting happens in the west, in particular at the so-called nose of Marinovka, where the German front line extends a little bit to the west. And this is where the fighting happens. This is where the soldiers are out in the open, on the frozen ground. They're not dug in. They don't have any shelter. Absolutely awful. How do you get supplies from one of the airports, the main one being Pitomnik, basically in the center of the pocket, to the front line? Very difficult. Well, you might say, well, brilliant. Well, we still got lots of horses. The German army is an army that works and lives on horses. The problem, of course, is they say, well, you've got all these horses. That's brilliant. You can eat them. So we don't have to fly in food supply. We can fly in ammunition. That is great. But that means all the horses are eaten. How do you then get, well, things from A to B? And you can see all sorts of issues. And when the Soviets finally overrun Pitomnik, in particular Pitomnik Airport, they find tons and tons of resupplies. The first time I went to Pitomnik, it's just a field in the middle of nowhere, I could still find lots of stuff. There were piles of German jackboots lying around, for example. It was still there, and that was in the early 2000s. So you can see all sorts, again, of logistical issues. The German Air Force didn't have enough planes, so they had to bring in transport planes from the Mediterranean. There are stories that some of these planes arrive, they can't fly because obviously they don't have de-icing kit because they've come from the Mediterranean. The weather isn't great. The nastiest experience when it comes to this in many respects was the Christmas period, 1942, because the weather was bad at the airfields. It was glorious sunshine in Stalingrad. Not a single plane flies in resupplies. So on average, the Air Force manages to fly in about 10% of the resupply that's needed. On the best day, it's about 25%. So everybody can see this is not going to work. What they're also trying to do, of course, is fly out all the wounded. and they fly out about a few thousand. But again, you can see it's not really what they wanted to achieve, and it's doomed from the start. Everyone can see this, but the army is now getting weaker and weaker and weaker. They've lost the chance, the moment where they could have tried to break out. Having said that, I would argue, Percy, it's with the benefit of hindsight. If you look at the situation in 1942, it did make sense to keep them where they were. And this is now the cold eye of the operational thinker. Because you already talked about the other operation. You mentioned Operation Saturn. And Uranus and Stalingrad in the Soviet phase and the Soviet plan was just supposed to be the first step. They thought the Sixth Army was actually much, much weaker than what they finally got in the bags. The Soviets are surprised themselves. Their idea was to rush towards Rostov, as you already said, and cut off the German troops in the Caucasus. And that would have been, not in inverted commas, only one army, but an entire army group with about 750,000 men. So keeping Sixth Army fighting, even though they're starving, they're dying, they're freezing to death, from an operational strategic point of view, as nasty as this sounds, makes a lot of sense. And because they're fixing these Soviet troops, when the Germans then rapidly withdraw from the Caucasus, the stories are that the last German troops leave Rostov on the Don, which is at the Black Sea, so that's really the cutoff point, and a few hours later, the first Soviet troops arrive. If they'd waited another week or 2 or 3, we would have had a much, much bigger disaster. It sounds awful, and it's absolutely awful for the people fighting in Stalingrad, but from a bigger point of view, it does make sense. But this is also one of the reasons why Stalingrad has so ingrained itself on the German and the Soviet psyche. It's not because it is the most costly battle, but it is the way the people die. It's absolutely awful.
Yeah, and I think one of the elements that I've thought about when I've read about the battle, when I was there as visiting the city, visiting some of the sites outside as well, the famous cemeteries on the edge of town, you think about, why did they keep fighting? And there are a couple of levels of how we can think about that. One of them you mentioned, there's the military logic of, okay, this army is cut off. It's essentially a lost cause. But if you take the human suffering element out of it, it can still serve a military operational purpose by preventing the Soviets from surrounding and cutting off a much larger group of men. There's a historian who's done some analysis of letters coming out of the pocket from German soldiers. And he found that essentially, they're still motivated to fight the war. They still feel that fighting in Stalingrad is going to help Germany achieve victory, and they still feel loyalty towards Hitler, towards the Führer, and are still willing to die for that cause. Now, there are many others who have other motivations as well, or who are also afraid, or who also don't want to fight. It's not all a bunch of fanatics and so forth, even those who think this way. But that is still a general motivator, let's say.
I think that is very much a motivator in the early stage, when they're still thinking, we've been ordered to stay put. The Führer knows what he's doing. The Führer will get us out. He will bail us out. That was the standard phrase that you had. Der Führer haut uns raus. That was the phrase that was being used. And in the early stages, yeah, that might have been there, particularly for the guys, I would probably argue, who were actually stationed in Stalingrad itself. Because compared to the other troops, they had that's completely the wrong word, but a better, I wouldn't say cushy, but a nice life, because they were in established positions. They might still have more supplies because they'd been there for quite some time. But I think also that, probably from the Christmas period onwards, that changes, because also the Christmas period, where they can hear Manstein approaching with his divisions. You already talked about this. They can hear the gunshots. They can hear they're getting closer and closer. Brilliant! So we're breaking out. We've done it. One corps under Seydlitz, they start burning all their stuff because, okay, tomorrow we're going, and then suddenly this is all cancelled, and they also hear that the guns are moving away again. And I think at that stage you have a drastic shift in the morale of the troops. What else could you do? Do you surrender? Well, you could do, yes. I think it also comes to what is being called a military strike. So a lot of people actually don't fight anymore. They sit in the dugouts, in the basements, wherever you can be, and not trying to get hit, because you know exactly if you're going to get wounded, that's your death sentence. And there are accounts from the Soviets as they're going round after the battle, and in the cellars, they still find hundreds and thousands of people. And the worst is when they go into the dressing stations. The main dressing station is under the old theater in the center of Stalingrad. Tens of thousands of wounded, and they don't know what to do with them. So basically, they either kill them or they just leave them to die, because that's what happens. And then shortly afterwards, you have an Allied delegation that comes to Stalingrad to have a look around after the battle. And even this delegation, weeks later, still finds Germans hiding in cellars because they're still there. So you can see very, very nasty. And of course, when you look at letters, you always have to take them with a pinch of salt, because when you know they're going to be sent back to Germany and they're going to be read by other people, by the censors, so be careful. But it's also one interesting thing that despite the whole problems with the resupply, when they were flying stuff out, one of the key things they made sure was trying to get letters out, letters in and letters out, because they realized that it was so important for morale to keep the troops fighting. So they're really, really interesting ones. But the moment you hit a low food supply, that is the beginning of the end. And in early December, so very early on, it's the first time that the German Medical Service of the 6th Army reports back that someone's died of starvation. And the reply that comes back from Berlin is, don't be silly, German soldiers don't starve to death, it's impossible. But it was possible, and it happened. So you can see that's not particularly good for morale, let's face it.
Now, that's not to say, of course, that the Soviet soldiers have an easy time of it fighting in and around Stalingrad. I mean, their logistical situation is quite difficult as well. Lots of the barges that they were using to get supplies across the river get hit by German artillery or German aircraft. So they're also short in terms of food and ammunition compared to what they would like to be. In fact, now I'm not 100% sure if I can say this on the podcast, but I'm going to try it anyway, and let's see. There's a little quote from a Soviet soldier when he was asked about his rations at Stalingrad. And he says, well, you won't die, but you won't be able to fuck. So I think, if listeners out there, I hope your children were not in the room, but you understand what that means. So it's enough to survive, but it's not enough to have any particular amount of energy or vigor. And as far as the Germans go, in terms of keeping up the morale in this later phase of the encirclement, when all hope is lost and the situation is unbelievably terrible, they fall back on what, in hindsight, seems like foolish methods, but at the time, this is part of the ideological thinking. Goebbels and Göring give radio speeches that are heard by the men in the pocket. Göring compares the German soldiers in the pocket at Stalingrad to the Spartans at Thermopylae in ancient times, fighting a glorious but ultimately hopeless battle against the Persians. Hitler throws promotions all over the place to different high-ranking officers, because there's several dozen German generals trapped in this pocket, right? This is not just a couple of commanders. He makes Paulus a field marshal, a Generalfeldmarschall, which is, pretty fancy rank. And he says no German field marshal has ever surrendered, in the hopes that Paulus will not surrender, which of course he then does in the end. And I think one of the little indications that these methods are not entirely successful is that just before the final pocket surrenders, because of course, in the course of January, the Soviets are able to split up the German presence in the city into multiple smaller pockets, which then surrender at different times. After multiple Soviet offers of surrender, by the way, it must be said, the Soviets offer in early January, Paulus asks Hitler refuses, etc., etc. But one of the final messages that the German garrison or German pocket sends out, it ends not with the usual Heil Hitler, but with long live Germany. And some have interpreted that as saying that, some in the pocket lost faith in the Führer, and this was their way of kind of communicating that. I don't know if that's making too much out of a very limited source, but I thought those are some interesting aspects of this final stand, so to speak, in January and then into the first couple of days of February.
There are also very interesting accounts from the Soviet side when they finally get into the headquarters at the German headquarters at the Univermarkt department store. And they get in there and they describe the filth. And because people hadn't gone out because they're under fire, and they said it's absolutely horrendous. And the stench, we wouldn't have expected that from the Germans in the German headquarters. And so the whole negotiations are then run by Paulus's chief of staff, Schmidt, because Pavlovs had gone into some sort of state of shock and he couldn't even be talked to. So you can see the whole psychological stress that these people are under. I mean, can't be compared to all the physical dying that was happening all around them on both sides, but you can see these issues. And you mentioned the promotion. And yes, again, there is the story that Schmidt, his chief of staff, goes in and says, here's the telegram from Hitler, and says, you've just been promoted. And Pavlovs then saying, thank you very much for your tact not to congratulate me on this, because we both know what that means. As you said, not a single German field marshal had gone into captivity. So this is the order to shoot yourself. That's exactly, and he doesn't. And it's really interesting when you then fast forward and look at Pavlovs's legacy, you might say. In Germany, in the 1950s, 60s, perhaps even 70s, or perhaps even 80s, when these people were still alive, what people were really holding against him was not that he stood and fight, because that was the Führer's order. That's what you do as a soldier. You obey the order. It's the fact that he went into captivity. And lots of people said that was basically such a weak character because he'd done that. On top of that, of course, after the war, after the battle, he's kept in captivity. He survives, one of the few. So 95,000, mainly German, also some other nations, soldiers go to captivity. About 6,000 of them return. The vast majority of them die in the first half year of captivity because they're so weak. And when you listen to the accounts from the German prisoners of war, they don't hold a grudge against the Soviets because there was nothing they could do. They didn't have any food. You sometimes had one Soviet guard guarding 1,000 Germans as they're marching on. What you do when someone sits down because he can't walk anymore? You just shoot them. So that was just the way it is. So they didn't hold a grudge at all. It's really interesting when you look at this. But so he, of course, was one of the lucky few ones to return. And he then goes into East Germany, into the GDR. And he's earmarked to become, the new head of the army. He then dies. But of course, that doesn't go down well either. And also, he's brought back to the Nuremberg trials where he gives a statement. Because in the previous stages of the war, he had been one of the main architect of Operation Barbarossa. So you can see there's all sorts of things coming together in Pavlovs himself. He was a very good strategic thinker. He was not an experienced troop commander. He was earmarked to become the new chief of the general staff. But people said, well, he needs to have another front command. So give him the strongest army, an operation that can't fail, that 6th Army going to Stalingrad. And it did fail. And so history hasn't been particularly kind to him. Was he weak? Was he not weak? An ongoing debate and discussion that you've had ever since, not only, of course, in German circles, but mainly there. Was it all Pavlovs' fault or not? So really an interesting debate.
And I'm glad you mentioned the situation with the German prisoners in this case, because one hears or sees sometimes that the statistic that about 90,000 Germans were taken prisoner at Stalingrad and only about 5,000 of them ever made it back to Germany. Now, there are different factors in that. It's sometimes you hear that the Soviets, indiscriminately slaughtered them all and were cruel to them. Well, yes, Soviet captivity was not a picnic. There's no question. There was a lot of hard labor, a lot of harsh winters in Siberia, disease and so forth. So quite a number died then. But a huge number died because there was nothing to be done for them when they were captured. And I think that's one of those partial myths that you hear sometimes about the battle, is that the Soviets, wholesale slaughtered 85 out of 90,000 prisoners, which is definitely not the case. Not to say the Soviets were nice to the German prisoners, but that is pretty much a myth.
And folks who are out there, you might have seen some footage from the Battle of Stalingrad, and it always ends with these long columns and lines of German prisoners of war being marched out to the prisoner of war camps. And when you look at them, they already look weak. They look broken. You can see they're not healthy. They've been malnourished. And don't forget, these are, by the standards of the day, the healthy ones, because the other ones you would find in the cellars, in the dressing stations. And there really was not much that the Soviets could have done for them. And as I said, the accounts from the Germans who actually did make it back, they said that was the only thing they could do. And some said even, well, you know what, shooting them, if they did that, was the most humane way. Really interesting, the dynamics. So again, you might say perhaps the embodiment of total war, what it does to people, and also the value of life and how that's decreased and basically disappears. You're just a number.
And that is borne out by the statistics, because the losses of the Stalingrad battle/campaign are immense. It's estimated that the Axis lose, so Germans plus Allies, between 800,000 and 1.5 million, depending on where you put how you define the Stalingrad battle or campaign. Between 800,000 and 1.5 million killed, wounded, missing, and prisoners. And the Soviets don't have it any better. Officially, they admit to 1.2 million killed, wounded, missing, but it's probably closer, according to some estimates, to about 1.4 million. So we are talking immense human suffering. And one of the things that helps me sometimes get around the problem of numbers, let's say, because if you're looking at World War II and you're interested in World War II, you see casualty statistics like the ones I just mentioned all the time. But how do you keep yourself in a human frame of mind? One of the things that helps me do that is reading sometimes extracts from letters or extracts from diaries. Now, as you mentioned, those can be tricky sources because people writing them sometimes have an ulterior motive, or they withhold certain things, or they say certain things that they don't mean, or what have you. So, like any other historical source, they need to be looked at critically. But just for getting across some of the human element, I think that diaries and letters are a source that works for me as a human, in addition to as someone who's interested in history. And that's why I wanted to read out one quote from a letter from a German who's caught in this pocket in January 1943. He's a priest, actually, so a chaplain serving with the German army, and he writes a letter to his family. And here's the little extract. I cannot stand it much longer, which you probably realize by now, but it has to be said. Dearest mother and father, I'm filled with regret and wish to atone for the times I have hurt you. I beg your forgiveness with childish humility. I can't express my gratitude in words. I just can't stand it all anymore. For my own sake, I am ready to die. For the sake of my parents and siblings, I cry out to God, help us, we're perishing. My Savior is with me and won't leave me. To whom could he be closer than one of his own priests? And so I hope that I do not flinch when the time comes, and that my last moment on this earth is not my weakest. And I don't know if there's a more human emotion than that when you're facing your own mortality, that you think of your parents and you think of your relationship with them, and you think of your regrets, and you think of your weaknesses as a human. And to me, that's kind of encapsulated in that letter. And that man, of course, is one of those 800,000 to 1.5 million. And it also reminds me of how hard it is to reconcile certain things when it comes to battles like Stalingrad and World War II in general. How can someone who is reflective and human and emotional, like the writer of that letter, be a part of an army that does things like the German army does? I mean, when the German army enters Stalingrad, they capture, in the fall, they capture a Soviet hospital for mentally handicapped children. And they execute all the children in there who were from 10 to 14 years old. So how do you have some Germans doing that and some Germans writing letters like this? And oftentimes they're the same people. And that, to me, is one of the human aspects that I find most fascinating about this total war that we see in Stalingrad.
That's, of course, very powerful stuff, isn't it? And you might say it's perhaps not surprising that this particular person turns to God when you look at his background. But it seems to be a general thing as well. And as you were reading this out, I was thinking of another example. When you go to Berlin, you go to the Gedächtniskirche, there is a sketch, and it's called the Madonna of Stalingrad. And so that was made at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, actually Christmas 1942. It was then flown out, and it says, I think it's peace, light, and hope on it, next to that lady that sketch there, and that's been on display in the Gedächtniskirche in Berlin for decades now. So again, you can see how people turn to this and trying to find some
comfort, some solace.
Exactly, whatever they're looking for in situations like this, when you know you can't get out and you're basically not only stuck, but being stuck is okay, but you know you're going to die. So it's it is very, very powerful. And again, because we now keep talking about the Germans a lot, but it's the same on the Soviets. Yes, they're winning, but still, I mean, they go through hardship as well, and it's particularly nasty for them. And you mentioned the casualty figures. So the Soviets, when you just look at the numbers game, no one looks at it this way, but you might argue, well, no one does it, but just if that's the way you want to do, it's actually, well, I wouldn't say German victory, but the Soviets lose far more men than the Germans do in this horrible battle. We tend to concentrate on the Germans because we got the sources. They tend to be more reliable. And as I said earlier, it's the way they died. The fact that they were written off by the political leaders and they're basically starved to death. They're left to die, to rot, what have you. That's the nasty thing about it. But the Soviets also die. There's so many Soviets that die, it's unbelievable. And when you go to Stalingrad now, Volgograd as it's called, and you look at the legacy of it and look at the battles and how it's all preserved, you can see what fundamental and central role the Battle of Stalingrad plays in the Russian mind. Go to Moscow, it's not there. You have a very small memorial at a place called Khimki. That's where the Germans went. It's in the middle of nowhere, next to a big IKEA. You can't even get there because surrounded by lots of roads. Go to Stalingrad. Stalingrad oozes the Battle of Stalingrad. And you already mentioned the big statue, which was built in the 1960s on the Mamayev Kurgan, which, by the way, when it was built, was the tallest statue ever made. It stands, when you increase the sword that the statue is holding, it's about twice the size of the Statue of Liberty. You see it everywhere. You've been there. You know what I'm talking about. It is so dominant. The whole thing is just so dominant. And you've got a burial place there. Zaitsev, the famous sniper, is buried there on the Mamayev Kurgan, where he spent most of the time fighting. You talked about the film earlier. Forget everything you see because he didn't fight where he fights in the film. He fought somewhere completely differently. You've got the generals buried there. So the commander of 62nd Army, we talked about him. He is buried there. You can see how important the whole Stalingrad legacy is. And it's really interesting that a few years ago was decreed by Putin that Volgograd would change the name back to Stalingrad for a few days every year. You can see, of course, there's also a lot of politics behind that, but you can see how important it is. And the same on the German side. If you ask a German or a Soviet or Russian person today, name the most famous battle of the Second World War, I would bet my house, my car, and everything else on it that they would say the Battle of Stalingrad. It just stands out so much. It really is the big battle of World War II for its sheer ferocity, the way people fought, the way they died, the nastiness that people died.
Well, that was an intense episode, I have to say. Folks, listeners out there, I hope you have a new appreciation for the unbelievable military, historical, and human event and tragedy and crime that was the Battle of Stalingrad. If you want to react, if you want to share your stories, if you've read about it, or if you found diaries or letters that have been published that touched you, or if you had the chance to go there, as Matthias and I did before the current situation made that not so likely anymore for the time being, let us know. Leave us a comment. I'm pretty much exhausted from that from that experience. We'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
And deep, dark operations. Why do I say dark? I've got no idea why I say dark.
I mean, in the context of World War II, it's not wrong.
Yeah, but that's, I think I'm thinking of deep, dark German woods because that's why I normally use that phrase. So maybe
because that's all the fairy tales you heard as a kid. Deep, dark German woods,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Next thing is I'm waiting for Hansel and Gretel to appear in Stalingrad. You never know. Just a quick one. Did you say von Paulus or Paulus?
I said von Paulus. He's not von Paulus?
No, he's just Paulus.
Damn it. Why did I think he's Friedrich von Paulus?
No, it's really Paulus. It's without a von.
I mistakenly ennobled him.
It just happens. A German general has to be a von. Otherwise, it simply doesn't work, obviously.